For 50 years, the Griffin Museum of Science and Industry has hosted the nation's premier exhibition of Black art. The Black Creativity Juried Art Exhibition features over 100 works from professional and emerging Black artists from across the country, highlighting Black achievement in art, science, and technology. Now open through April 27th. For more details, visit msichicago.org. Today on CityCast Chicago, Governor Pritzker delivers a fiery address and modest budget. How has Chicago spent its COVID relief money? And Chicago area restaurant weeks are just getting started, my friends. Helping me break it all down, executive producer Simone Alisea. It's Tuesday, February 25th. I'm Jacoby Cochran, and this is what Chicago's talking about. Morning, Simone. How you feeling? How was your weekend?
I'm doing okay. It was all right. Got out, did some stuff, also stayed home. What about you?
I also got out, did some stuff. I got to see a lot of my family members at the Bulls game, even though they lost. Hung out with my mom a little bit. I did hit the Joe Fresh Goods 992 New Balance Age Well, which I haven't hit a single one of his shoes with their collection. I haven't been willing to stand out in the cold or in the long lines over the years. And yeah, I finally got blessed with a pair. So I'm real excited about that. Congratulations.
This has been a long time coming. We've talked about this for as long as I've known you. We've been talking about this.
Last week, Governor J.B. Pritzker delivered his $55 billion budget proposal. He spent a good amount of time attacking the Trump administration for their chaotic overhaul of the federal government. But during it, he also laid out his spending plan. Simone, can you kind of lay this out? $55 billion and a smaller budget gap than expected.
Yeah, let's start there, because I think that's probably the thing that folks may remember the last time we talked about the state budget. During the initial forecast in the fall, the state was projecting a $3 billion budget gap. And of course, the question, how are you going to fill the gap? How are you going to fill the gap? How are you going to fill the gap? In this address, those projections were revised to about half of that. It was 1.7 billion or 1.4 billion, somewhere around there, about half of what the original gap was supposed to be, due to higher than expected projected tax revenues. Is what Pritzker said in his address. And so we didn't see in this budget proposal any huge cuts. I wouldn't call it an austerity budget, but he did warn against increased spending, particularly outside of education, healthcare, and pensions. And basically said, you know, if these departments want to make an argument for increased spending, we're going to need to see where additional cuts are for things outside of those big categories.
Yeah, of those three categories that you mentioned, pensions is the sort of most secure in the sense that they are making their legally required $10.6 billion payment, which is 20% of the general fund's budget. So again, decades and decades of kicking the can down the road. We are in that now, my friends. He is planning on making that $350 million investment in education, as you mentioned. However, that is far from like the $1 billion that Chicago Public Schools, Chicago Teachers Union, and the mayor's administration here in the city have pushed the state to contribute.
Yeah, you're talking about the sort of evidence-based formula, right? That prompts the state funding of K-12 schools. And yeah, both the school district, Chicago Public Schools, and the Chicago Teachers Union, again, back when they were playing nicely last spring, were in Springfield asking for more money. They say the city requires about $1 billion more. And so that $300 million falls short of that number.
A couple of pushbacks in this budget were, of course, to cuts to medical coverage for undocumented peoples aged 42 to 65. they are going to continue their funding for seniors over 65 who are undocumented. But 42 to 65 is still a good amount of people. And then they do not address the forthcoming like regional transit financial cliff, some $700 million gap that is looming in the coming year.
Yeah, that health coverage rollback that you mentioned, this is an interesting one, particularly for a few reasons. Number one, you have sort of just the general context of Pritzker and his anti-Trumpness, and specifically when it comes to immigration and immigration enforcement and deportations, that Illinois will continue to,
I was going to say, stand in opposition to Trump policies, to not work with immigration officers, to so-called be a safe haven, not only statewide, but in major cities. However,
right. But you have this program, and it's interesting because in 2023, the state actually paused this for a minute. And that's the other thing, too. It's not just for undocumented folks in particular. It's for anyone who's not a citizen. So the program serving non-citizens ages 65 and older had been around for a little bit longer and, introduced for seniors in 2020. It was then expanded to include adults, 42 to 64 as part of that. But that expansion costs a lot of money. That was a really wide net that Illinois ended up casting. And in fact, it cost so much that in 2023, Pritzker put a pause on the program, to a huge uproar. This was especially because at that time, this was the height of, migrants being sent to Chicago from the border and to Illinois writ large. And so he ended up lifting that pause, made some adjustments, enrollments began again. But now he's sort of saying like, no, we got to cut this back. We can't keep doing this. It's one of the larger cuts that we're seeing in this budget.
Given that this is just the proposal stage, do you think that any pushback will lead the governor to reversing course once again?
I mean, that's the trick. It's not so much about getting the governor to reverse course. The question is what are lawmakers in Springfield going to amend, propose, legislate to adjust this? And, will it be so radical that for some reason the governor, tries to veto it? On this front, I don't know. I think, there are obviously lots of Chicago area lawmakers who are looking to push and increase and strengthen protections for immigrants and undocumented folks. But, I think Pritzker, again, has sort of said his piece in terms of he is certainly going to be asking, if we're increasing spending in some places, where are we cutting spending elsewhere in order to make up for that?
Mm-hmm. And as it relates to no new money for regional transit, it feels like State Rep Cam Buckner was in some ways preparing us for the reality that no new funding may be coming in this budget or in the next one either. Like, we have to go back to the drawing board and come up with more creative solutions. And it feels like RTA doesn't have it. CTA doesn't have it. The city doesn't have it. They're all looking at the state and it doesn't even get a line.
Right. Last summer, there was all this talk about a potential merger, right, of CTA, PACE, Metra, and the Regional Transit Authority, the RTA, which is sort of this board that kind of oversees funding that funnels from the state into all these agencies. And, if that merger were to go through, that would have financial impacts not only for the Chicago area agencies that I mentioned, but, that would have financial impacts for how the state funnels transit money into Chicago area transit. And so you would think maybe this might be something that would come up. It's certainly something I think Chicago voters are watching very closely, and not just Chicago land voters, Cook County and the suburbs as well. The fact that wasn't mentioned in his address, I think maybe perked up a few ears there. There have been some alternative plans that wouldn't involve a whole merger, but would involve maybe kind of restructuring or giving the RTA more authority over the other agencies. At least as of last summer, as of last year, the heads of CTA, Metra, and PACE, had said they oppose any type of merger. They don't want to come together. They're just sort of like, we just need more resources. We need more resources. And so, yeah, I don't think this means that the topic is off the table in Springfield. I still think this is going to come up in legislation and in some way, shape, or form, but it may not be as key to the budget itself.
Back for a second year due to popular demand, Black Creativity Night Out returns to the Museum of Science and Industry on Friday, March 21st from 6 p.m. to 10 p.m. This over 21 event is part gallery walk, part function, and it's going to be a great time, y'all. Get an exclusive look at the Black Creativity Juried Art exhibition, plus many of the museum's most popular exhibits without all of those crowds. Celebrate Black creativity in all its forms with featured artists from the Juried Art exhibition, amazing performances, and a lively dance floor. The evening will highlight Black creatives from the Chicagoland area and beyond. You don't want to miss this unforgettable night of culture and enjoyment. For tickets and more information, visit msichicago.org. I've got some great Chicago theater you don't want to miss. Steppenwolf Theater revives Fool for Love by Sam Shepard. Perhaps the sexiest, most haunting play of the 20th century, Fool for Love is a twisted tequila-soaked love letter from one of the greatest American playwrights, indulging the need to get inside someone just to tear them apart. The Sun-Times and Daily Herald gave it 4 stars, and the Reader calls it an exhilarating acting showcase. The show is peak Steppenwolf with searing performances and masterful direction and a revival of this eerie, ominous, and beautiful masterpiece. Fool for Love is on stage now and extended by popular demand through March 23rd. But don't wait. Get tickets now at steppenwolf.org. Chicago has less than 2 years to spend some $142 million in COVID relief money. Our friends over at WTTW has released a new report analyzing what we've spent so far. Simone, what jumps out to you?
Yeah, we're really having the budget show here on CityCast Chicago today. One thing that jumps out on this report, and our friend Heather Sharon at TTW put this together, there is specifically a graph that shows how much of the $1.9 billion that Chicago has received in COVID relief funding has been budgeted, and then how much has actually been spent. It's broken down by sort of a category that has been spent: arts and culture, direct assistance, health and wellness, etc. What you will see is that in many of these areas, we haven't spent nearly as much as has been budgeted. And there is a deadline to spend this money. And that's why we're kind of so concerned with how fast Chicago is spending it, because if we hit that deadline and we haven't spent the money that has been budgeted, that money just goes away.
The city has spent 1.3 of the total, $1.9 billion on shoring up the city's pandemic devastated budgets from 2021 to 2024. In Mayor Johnson's most recent budget, $87 million of this relief money that was supposed to go into these 10 different buckets was also used to shore up the city's budget. And when you look at some of these individual categories and think about what we know about the pandemic, the fact that 30 million hasn't been spent on violence prevention, when we've had so much conversation around the impact of the pandemic, when we look at $20 million with assistance to families.
Sort of cut to what was originally budgeted in those buckets, you mean? Yeah.
Exactly. And so the fact that some of the biggest gaps are in places in which we know the pandemic ran roughshod over in terms of family security, health and wellness, violence prevention, the question then becomes what is the plan?
I think this is a really complicated question, because I want us to think back to 2021 when the American Rescue Plan came out and all this money got sent to cities and states, because kind of the point of this was that city budgets were struggling.
100%.
City budgets were, right? Remember, we had record unemployment. So you had people who were out of work. That means less tax revenues, but think especially like sales tax, which makes up a huge portion of city budgets, right? You have states who are paying out unemployment, which is a huge cost, right? You have rising public health costs, right? You have to roll out this vaccine and people are getting sick, and you have rising costs and lower tax revenues. And kind of the whole point of this was to help cities shore up existing budgets.
And I understand that. And I think it makes sense why the split is so drastic when you think of like less than 25% of the nearly $2 billion was even budgeted for this particular part of the recovery plan for these 10 different categories. I think my concern is not that we're being hesitant with completely spending all of that money on short-term programs, knowing that we may not be able to continue to fund them after all the money's dried up. It's the fact that we've gotten so close to the deadline and we have still had to, we've still cut programs with money left on the table.
Well, and because there are still budget concerns, right? I think that's the real trick. There are still budget concerns that the city of Chicago has to deal with. That said, I think the other real key part of this is the way former Mayor Lightfoot and now Mayor Johnson have talked about using this money. What they said when this money started coming in is, we're going to use this to do all the stuff, fund the programs that
they got bright-eyed and bushy-tailed.
We haven't been able to do. We are going to, this is a transformative amount of money in Chicago. We're going to use it transformatively, which, is lofty. But as you point out, it's a finite amount of money. You have a finite amount of time to use it. That's why we have all these pilot programs. I mean, we're using this money to fund, for example, the 911 alternatives to bring mental health folks and other providers to 911 calls instead of police officers where it's necessary, right? This money has been used to fund a helpline to get people connected to social services. This is the money that has funded Chicago's guaranteed income pilot, which the status of which now is still very much up in the air of, are they going to pick it back up or not? In addition to, is the city going to actually spend all the money and not leave any on the table, to this time question, and actually do it? What happens to these programs when the money runs out? What are you going to do? Is the city of Chicago's budget in a better place than it was 5 years ago? I would say probably a little bit, yes. But of course, we also saw in the last budget debate, it's always a little tenuous. It's always on the edge of, can we raise the revenue? And if not, are we making cuts? And I think it's tough. Even back in June, you had alder people who were saying that, oh, well, there should be more aldermanic oversight of the way these federal funds are used, so we can make more long-term decisions about, setting Chicago up better for future years. I think that raises a question of, does that mean it's going to take even more time to spend this money, in addition to, when you're building a new program, hiring all those people and actually staffing that program?
Yeah, and it is important. You point out the guaranteed income pilot, which was sacrificed in the 2025 budget. And at least in that case, it didn't take money out of people's hands. It didn't take money out of organizations, but you did see a program that was meant to help small business owners get technology lost, I think $20 million or so. And so they were very strategic cuts, but I think, for a lot of people, again, given this deadline fast approaching with 142 left in the bank, it's tough to swallow if we don't have a clear vision for what we're going to do with this money moving forward. And I'm trying to give the city benefit of the doubt. But if we end up in a situation where we lose any of this money.
Oh, yeah. If they don't spend it all, I suspect that the city can get $142 million out the door by the end of 2026. I think that is possible. But I think the bigger question is, did this money help set Chicago's budget up to be more sustainable in the future? I think that's a big question. And then B, if it didn't do that, did the programs that it helped to fund, did it build those in a way that is sustainable?
Chicago Black Restaurant Week just closed out, celebrating 10 years. But if you look, you can still find deals at localized restaurant weeks in the neighborhoods and in the suburbs. We got Northside Restaurant Week coming up, Rosemont and more starting this weekend. Simone, if you were designing your own Chicagoland Restaurant Week, how would you do it?
Yeah, I was thinking about this because I was looking this up because I was just kind of shocked at how many of these localized restaurant weeks there were, especially coming off of Chicago Black Restaurant Week, coming off Chicago Restaurant Week, in January and February. And I was shocked to find, because I looked, and at least that I could find for 2025, that there was no Pilsen Restaurant Week, and there was no Chinatown Restaurant Week. Those are two neighborhoods.
It's not a Chinatown
at least
restaurant?
For 2025 that I could find. Pilsen had one in 2020 that was put on by Pilsen Fest that I found at Old
And
Face.
there's like an AAPI Restaurant Week, isn't there? Which isn't the same thing, but and there's a Latin Restaurant Week that takes place in August.
There is a Latin Restaurant Week that takes place in August. I think in 2024, there was an AAPI Restaurant Week in May. I don't know if they're going to do that again, but it's specifically neighborhood focused. Those are, and they could even combine, they're kind of close enough that they could even have that's just one that I'm there are so many restaurants in those neighborhoods, particularly really small, locally owned restaurants. And you wouldn't even have to do it as a prefix menu, right? As a set menu like they do during Restaurant Week. So Greektown Restaurant Week, for example, which is coming up here next week, they kind of do you'll get a free baklava with your meal during this week, or you get 50% off wine, or what, they just kind of do little deals as opposed to a full prefix menu. And I would love to see something like that in Chinatown and Pilsen.
Come on now.
What about you? Is there a restaurant week you're craving in Chicago?
Craving's an interesting word, but the one that I first thought of was you have to be this old to ride, sort of one only for the elders of the restaurant gang.
Oh, interesting. Oh, so you're saying restaurants that are older?
I'm thinking old fashioned donuts, been around since the 70s. Calumet Fisheries, been around since the 40s. Coletti's out in Jefferson Park,
the
Vito
OG Restaurant Week.
Yeah. Mario's, Italian Fiesta. I'm thinking about the old school restaurants that don't, at least for most of the Chicago restaurant weeks, I don't see a lot of those restaurants on there. So it's you have to be at least 40, 50 years old to be inside of this restaurant week. I think you can curate some a pretty good list with just focusing on those.
That would be really fun. I'd really enjoy that. And I feel like that is ripe for a passport style game where it's you mark off everywhere you go and you compare and contrast. Northside Restaurant Week is happening starting on Thursday and runs through March 9th. And that covers, lots of Northside neighborhoods up in Uptown near me, but also some Northwest Side neighborhoods, Albany Park. And I am a little miffed that I couldn't find a Southside Restaurant Week.
I agree with you, though. We definitely need a West Side Restaurant Week. We need a South Side Restaurant Week. On the edges, stuff that's only on the
yeah. Everything, all the border. I mean, again, it is shocking kind of how many there are just coming up here. Andersonville Restaurant Week is ongoing right now through March 2nd. LaGrange has a restaurant week that starts Thursday. There is a Chicago Northwest Suburban Restaurant Week that starts on Friday. It covers spots like Schaumburg, Arlington Heights. And then Westtown also has a restaurant week coming up near the end of the month starting March 21st.
Shout out to all of these different Chamber of Commerce, all these different orgs just coming together. Are you planning to go anywhere in one of the ones near you, Northside, Andersonville?
If I don't end up at Andersonville Restaurant Week this week, I think I might have failed. I think something has gone terribly wrong. If I miss this Andersonville specific one, I will try to probably make it around the Northside Restaurant Week because, again, I really have no excuse when it's right here.
I'm going to try to get to one of these places on Westtown. I always need no excuse to go.
It's a great spot for dining.
I need no excuse to go to Brazzero or JJ Thai Street Food. So I'm going to probably pull up. I want to give a huge thanks to our guest today, super producer Simone Alicea.
Hey, thanks, Jacoby.
Before we get out of here, please bookmark our website, chicago.citycast.fm. The CityCast Chicago Fund does not have to end here. We have neighborhood and walking guides, old podcast episodes, and you can subscribe to our daily newsletter, Hey Chicago, and so much more. Of course, we can't hit end without some good news. Celebrate Black History Month at the Chicago Justice Gallery on UIC's campus this Thursday at 6 p.m. They're hosting a special double feature. They're screening Beneath the Surface and Reimagining Safety, followed by a talk with one of the filmmakers. To learn more about both of the features, please check the link in our show notes. As always, we appreciate you for listening and reading. We're going to be back bright and early tomorrow. We'll talk to you then. Peace.
Is that a vacuum?
Yeah.
Are you vacuuming your desk?
I just had a couple of things on it that I wanted to...
Right now?
I know, I'm sorry. Yeah, I was just like, man, this is a little dusty. Let me get some of this out of my way.